That's not surprising. All right. Brakes test 5. Brakes test 5. The two basic types of brake power boosters are vacuum assisted and electronic assisted. Is that true or is that false?
True.
True.
What do you think?
Wait, which one's we on?
Have you ever seen any electronic brake power boosters?
Diesels?
Huh?
Diesels?
Can you have electronically power boosted brakes?
Diesels?
Huh?
Diesels don't have vacuum, do they?
What? What?
Diesels don't have vacuum, do they?
Which one? Diesels don't, but they don't use electronic.
I've never heard of electronic brake boosters.
I haven't either. That's why this question is false. Yep.
What do diesels use for brakes? Air brake?
They actually, no, they've got power brake pressure that does it. You got it?
Power brake pressure?
Yeah, the power brake fluid sends pressure to the power brake booster, and it's a hydro boost. And you probably have that on those Humvees. Probably got hydraulically assisted power brakes on those.
Doesn't surprise me any.
Yeah, that's typically the way that kind of thing goes. But, okay, I was getting ready to show you guys a picture in a minute whenever this computer quits thinking. Okay, atmospheric pressure acting on the pedal side of a booster diaphragm results in boosted pressure to the master cylinder's primary piston. Atmospheric pressure acting on the pedal side of a booster diaphragm results in boosted pressure to the master cylinder's primary piston.
Foot pressure, not atmospheric.
You're actually, no, it's not foot pressure that's helping you do it. We're talking power brakes here. Okay, so what you're going to do is when you hit your brake pedal, you move a spool valve in there, and basically it causes the atmosphere, it's basically it's opening up a vent and it lets atmospheric pressure come into that booster and it's pushing on the back of the diaphragm. There is a reason why that diaphragm is this big around, because you want a lot of square inches for this 14.5 pounds per square inch to push against.
Why it's got vacuum on the
It's
other
got
side?
vacuum on both sides until you hit the brake, and then it shuts off the vacuum to the backside, and atmospheric pressure comes in there, and it helps you apply the brake. You got me? So, and that's what the deal is. It actually can, and when it'll come to a place, you know, the spool valve basically, and I showed you that on the very first day. Do you remember that? Those slides we went through on the power brake booster? That's what this is talking about. So on the pedal side of it, the atmospheric pressure is actually what's doing that. Because what's causing things to move is not vacuum, it's pressure. Pressure is what causes things to move. So what is vacuum?
The absence of air.
The absence of pressure. So what is cold?
The absence of heat.
Exactly. So basically what you're talking about, the absence of, you know, vacuum is not a tangible thing. It's the absence of something else, if that makes any sense. Okay, brakes will no longer work after all the vacuum has been used. True or false?
False.
Do you know how stupid it would be to design that way? I mean, do you know? Okay, you're basically going to have regular brakes if your power brakes fail. Hydraulic boost is constant even if the engine is under load.
False.
Well, actually, that's true.
That's true, because it's hydraulic boost.
Yeah, it's hydraulic boost, and if the engine's running, you got hydraulic pressure. And if engine's under load, it's obviously running. In a Power Master booster, the power steering fluid can be added to the master cylinder reservoir with no ill effects. Don't ever put power steering fluid in the master cylinder, because that will swell all the rubber up and everything had to be rebuilt. And if you're having it done somewhere where they charge you, it's like several $1,000s. So always put only brake fluid in the brake booster. I mean, in the master cylinder. Now, you don't put anything in the brake booster. You're going to use power steering fluid from your that system. Yeah. When testing a hydraulic pressure storage system, finding a brake pedal that's hard to push on the first application means the accumulator is leaking, and that is true. That is true. In order for their vacuum boosters to operate, vehicles with diesel engines need a separate pump for their vacuum supply. That's right. It's true. If they have a vacuum booster, they've got a little vacuum pump, and it's got a pulley on it that looks like a power steering pulley. Now remember what I told you about your pulley sizes. Your power steering pulley is a big pulley. Your alternator pulley is a little pulley. There's a reason why those pulleys are those sizes, right? So you need to be able to produce a couple of 1,000 pounds of pressure on these power steering systems, so you're going to have a pretty good sized pulley on there. air conditioning is hard to pull, you know, because you're operating at compressor, you got a big pulley on it. So if it's hard to pull, you're going to have a big pulley. And the speed of it is basically something else too, like on a water pump. You know, the water pump is going to take a little effort to turn, not a ton of effort, but it's going to take some effort. It won't be as hard to pull as a power steering pump. But you're wanting it not to spin really, really fast because you don't want it cavitating and making air bubbles and whipping up foam. So that basically the size of it is more related on the water pump to the speed of it than it is the power that's needed. Okay, adding power steering, the brake pedal ratio is the ratio of the length of the lever arms on the brake pedal assembly. We don't ever think about that. That's not even an important question, but it is true. Adding power steering fluid to the master brake cylinder is a very dangerous mistake that could lead to total brake failure.
True.
It won't typically lead to brake failure, but what it will cause them to do, I'm telling you, it'll cause the brakes to lock up and not come loose. I mean, that's usually what happens. It'll get to where it's holding the brakes all the time, and it's slower and slower and slower, and it gets to where you can't even go because the brakes are holding the car. Huh?
Isn't that a type of brake failure?
Yes, you can call that. So 9 is actually going to be true. And 10, the power piston is the interface between the front push rod and the master cylinder.
True.
That's false. He was just guessing out of air about that.
Maybe.
A tandem diaphragm booster, a tandem diaphragm vacuum booster has one diaphragm instead of two. That sound, tandem is talking about two, am I right? Okay, number 12, power boosters are mounted where? Come on, y'all, don't be dumb.
Between the brake pedal and the master cylinder.
Between the brake pedal lever and the master cylinder, yeah, that's a C. To multiply the force coming from the brake pedal, vacuum boosters rely on what?
Pressure differential.
Yeah, so pressure differential across the diaphragm. Number 14, an undesirable hissing noise caused by air rushing into the chambers of a vacuum booster is prevented by means of what?
Control valve.
You guys are really funny.
Why is it ACVD?
It's a filter. Have you looked at there's a little accordion boot that's right up there that's around it's coming out of that booster. And that little accordion boot has got some little fibrous filter looking stuff showing through some holes. You know what I mean? And what happens is when that air goes through there, it has to go through those little filters and it neutralizes that sound. How many of you guys have ever driven a vehicle for a long time that had no power brakes? Isn't that just wonderful? You have to mash that brake that hard. It really muscles up that leg, don't it? Sometimes you got to use both legs. You did too, didn't you? Yeah, you know, you drove one with no brakes, didn't you, for a while?
Yeah.
Okay, all right then. Number 15. All of the following are advantages of a tandem diaphragm booster except what?
B.
Doubling of surface area that provides improved gas mileage, please. That's wrong. That's an except. This is like an ASC question. You're going to see ASC questions that says all of the above are correct except, to prevent fluctuating manifold pressures from affecting the amount of vacuum available to the booster, vacuum is often stored in a what?
Accumulator.
Anybody else got any ideas? Reservoir. Reservoir.
That one's ACVD.
Now we used to have on some of these vehicles, the cruise control was vacuum operated, and whenever you were going up a hill and your cruise control was applying the throttle, what was happening to the vacuum? It was going away because you were loaded. When you vacuum goes away when the engine's loaded. Okay, so when you were going up a hill with cruise control on, it would basically cut its own throat because it was requiring vacuum to operate the vacuum operated cruise control, but the more you went into the throttle, the less vacuum you had and the less the cruise control would work, and there was a kit to fix that. And have you ever looked under the hood of an older car and seen a can over there mounted on the fender that looked like a high-C drink can? That's a vacuum reservoir. It's a cheap vacuum reservoir, and it's got some little, and that's what we would put on there. We'd put one of those on there, and it had a little check valve built into the top so that it stored muscle vacuum to make things happen. Anytime you see a vacuum reservoir, it's there to combat the loss of vacuum when you're deep into a load. On an air conditioning system, Moody, when you're deep into the throttle and the air conditioner dumps into the defrost, you need to go looking for a vacuum leak in your AC control lines, or in the AC reservoir out there under the hood, or in the little one-way valve that goes to that vacuum reservoir. So just keep that in mind. It's going to default to defrost when there's no vacuum. If it's in defrost all the time, you'll probably find a vacuum hose unhooked under the hood somewhere. Got me? All right. In a hydraulic booster, boost pressure is obtained from what?
The power steering pump.
The power steering pump. We talked about that earlier, but we have deer in the headlights people sitting around here. To isolate the cause of vacuum not being stored in a vacuum reservoir, inspect all of the following except what? The spool valve for sticking. How can you get to that dadgum spool valve? Ain't no
Very
way.
carefully.
You ain't, but be careful when you're taking apart a big diaphragm of any kind like that, because a lot of times there's big springs in them. They could take your head off if you're not careful. Power brake boosters, not so much, but some of those maxi-based boosters on truck. Incidentally, I was going to tell you one day, and this has got to do with what we're talking about, and so it's not just a funny story. I was at the Ford dealership, and I walked by these guys in the new car department that were working on a vehicle that whenever you would give it the gas, it would go, it would whistle. And it was a brand new vehicle, right off the new vehicle lot. And this guy was going to buy it if they could get that fixed before quitting time. And when you cracked the throttle, it sounded like it was whistling past a bad throttle body gasket or something. And they put a throttle body gasket on it that they had to make because the parts room didn't, I don't know why, when they pulled it apart, they didn't notice there's nothing wrong with this throttle body gasket. They were so sure it was related to the throttle that they just, replaced the throttle body gasket. And so I walked by there and I got interested in that. You ever walk past the job somebody else is doing and just get interested in it?
All the time.
I mean, when they're troubleshooting it, and I'm not talking about just because you're tired of pulling the transmission out of your expedition and you're going to help somebody do tires. But what I mean is, I walked by and I got a piece of hose that was laying on the bench over there, and I put it up to my ear, and I started listening for this noise. And that little check valve on the brake booster was cracked in a curved way so you couldn't see it. And whenever it wasn't loud at the throttle body, but as I vectored in on it, I found it over there at that booster. And I said, there's your problem right there. So I pulled it out, and we got another one of those that we got from somewhere. I don't know where it came from, another truck or something. Popped it in there, and that was all gone. And yay, they made the sale. And the sales manager came in and gave me $10 to buy lunch the next day. Man, you didn't have to stop and help with that, but I appreciate that you did. Anytime that you take that attitude that you want to, make things better for other people, it's good. As long as you're not helping them and cutting your own throat. Because if you're getting paid commission and you're over here trying to get your work out and you stop on yours just because you're interested and you burn an hour helping these people, you've lost an hour of your own money. You got me? So really be careful about that. Sometimes you're going to need to help them a little bit. But this hogwash about come over here and help me find this bolt that I've lost, I don't have no time for that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, this is something you can do. You know what I mean? You can get a mirror and a light and you can find that bolt or socket or whatever you lost. Also, if you drop a socket that may cost you $2 or $3 to replace, don't spend $20 worth of time looking for it. Just write the darn thing off and get you another socket. You know what I mean? Got it? All right. Now then, some people just get sick about that, though. They can't stand it. And I'm just about one of them. All right. Which one of the following steps is done first when testing vacuum booster operation? In other words, if somebody says, I want to know if the booster is working,
I'd say C.
that's going to be B. You're going to turn off the engine, right? The first thing you're going to do is turn off the engine, then you're going to pump the brake, and until you're sure there's no vacuum stored anywhere. And then you're going to put your foot on the brake, and if you've got a working vacuum booster, how's that brake pedal going to feel when you start it?
It's going to be stiff.
It's going to go down. It's going to start out stiff, and it's going to go down. Now, how many of you have ever been bleeding brakes, and you bled the brakes, and you bled the brakes, and when you got through, you'd swear that thing was perfect, but when you crank it up, it goes to the floor, and you got no brakes. You ever had that? That really sort of stinks. That's why in some cases it's a good idea to bleed the brakes with the engine running, just so you'll know when the pedal's right. Okay? And you got to know when the pedal's right, though, because the other day we had a situation with a couple of people killing themselves trying to bleed brakes, and when I went and checked, whenever they, walked away for a minute, they were done, and they didn't know it.
Story of my life.
Yeah, I mean, they were done. They were completely done. And I mean, he says, how does the pedal feel? The guy sitting in there in the air conditioning says, oh, it still don't feel good. And the guy back here that was sweating bullets trying to bleed the brakes, are you sure? And then I went and felt something, and that pedal felt like a new car. Okay. Which of the following steps is done last when testing vacuum booster operation?
A.
Evaluate the amount of movement in the brake pedal. That's last, sweetie. Got it? All right. Now then, let's move on to test 6. You got that?
Got it.
We may get through early enough to where we can go back out in the shop and work another 30 minutes before lunch. Wouldn't you like that? I'm hoping mostly our floor will be dry when we're through, when we did our cleaning up. Most parking brakes, and we're talking about parking brakes, this is brakes test 6. Most parking brakes use a separate set of brakes that are applied independently of the surface brakes.
True.
Okay, that's most parking brakes. And what would be the exception to that?
Let's see, disc brakes that don't have that hat.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Because the parking brakes are always on the rear wheels, right? Why do we call them parking brakes instead of emergency brakes?
Because
They're not usually adequate to stop the car in an emergency. Now, if you're like me and your other brakes fail, you're going to be grabbing that brake handle and trying to stop, do everything you can to stop.
shift into a lower gear
But
first.
twice in my life I've hit the brakes and felt the pedal go to the floor because a brake line ruptured. Let me tell you about those brake lines going to the back. And laying up in the frame rail on these trucks that have dirt in them because Moody's been four-wheeling. It actually traps water right up in there around that steel brake line, and it slowly erodes it away. And then one day when you go to hit it, it'll be like stepping on a plum, to quote C.W. McCall. It'll go onto the floor, and you'll see brake fluid dripping from back there, somewhere near the back wheel. And you go up in there, and you'll find out that it's been laying in dirt and mud, and moisture's been up in there, and it has just rotted that brake line away. So make darn sure whenever you're coming back after a mud incident that you watch the inside of that frame rail out and get all that mud out of there.
That happened to me coming up to an intersection one time. And I went right through it.
Yep.
Scared the tar out of me.
Yeah. I was driving a Volkswagen Rabbits used to have the brake line running under the carpet, and that was kind of silly. Usually, bless their hearts, those Germans are smarter than that when it comes to mechanical stuff. They're pretty good about doing mechanical stuff. And those Germans are. They're really good. And I hit the brakes on that thing at the Ross Clark Circle down there. I was working at Bondi's, and I hit the brake, and I heard something go under the carpet, and I was, scared me silly because I was about to go out in front of a semi. But I mean, this stuff is serious business. And just because you don't know anybody that's ever experienced brake failure doesn't mean you'll never meet anybody. And if it's one of your customers, and you should have caught it, you see. All right. Anytime you're looking at buying an old pickup, always think about those brake lines. You know what I mean? One time, my dad bought a car sight unseen for $50 from a couple of soldiers, and they said, "We're tired of fooling with this. It's up in front of Joe C. Jones." So he gave him $50, went up there, put the coil wire back on it, and drove it back to the shop. And it was a ratty old thing. It had flowers painted all over it. An old Volkswagen Beetle, about a 64 model or something. And so it had a 2-barrel carburetor on it and all that stuff. They've been trying to hot rod it a little bit. And so I was driving this thing, wasn't familiar with the car, just driving around, me and this guy. And we were really gentlemen because the only thing the back seat had back there was a board. And we had this girl sitting in the back on a board. She was just sitting on a board, and us guys, we were sitting up in the comfortable front seats. Well, I was coming down to an intersection, and he says, "There's a stop sign up here." And I said, "I know, it's on College Street over at Enterprise." And when I hit the brake, it suddenly went to the floor, and there was 2 vehicles coming that are 20 feet apart, and I went between them. And that was scary as all get out. All I could see was that truck I was about to run into the side of, and then he was gone, and I went across, and I saw that car in my rearview mirror. That's how quick that happened. But that was good brakes one application, no brakes the next. And that can lead to disaster. It was funny that day, but every one of us got a little white hair, just make your hair stand up. Okay, how did I get off on all that? To avoid putting undue stress on the park brake cable, it's best to press and hold the service brake pedal and then apply the park brake.
I'm good for that.
That is true, but who on earth has ever done that? Have you done it?
Yeah.
Leave it to Lundy. Good grief.
Well,
I haven't done it on purpose.
my fiance's car, whenever she stops, it rolls back a little bit, and then when you put it in gear, it slams in gear.
Yeah.
So I always hold the brake, put it in park, and then hit the emergency or the parking brake. And then that way, whenever you take it off and put it in gear, it just goes like you leave.
Yeah, you've learned, you've got to work around. And that's smart, you know, figure something out like that. Let's see.
She doesn't like
Ideally, you should use the park brake as little as possible to be sure the mechanism operates correctly when you do need to use it. That's false. I tell you what did happen though. I drove that 95 Taurus and never used the park brake ever for any, because I put it in park. Why do I need a park brake? You know, it ain't gonna roll when it's in park. I mean, you know. And so one day I had the students put an air conditioner compressor on it. That was here. I mean, I was here at the time. And they put an air conditioner compressor on it, and the guy that parked it was a conscientious son of a gun. Every time he parked any car, he locked that park brake hard, all the way to the floor. Well, unbeknownst to me, because I hadn't been using it, the red brake light didn't work. And so I got in that thing and drove it all the way to Enterprise with the park brake on. And when I would come to Tartan Pines down there and went to hit the brake, I didn't have hardly any brakes, and I realized that the back brake, the park brake was on, and the brake fluid was boiling going to
Wow.
those back brakes. So I had to rebuild the back brakes, you know. But my goodness, one time my wife drove her car because the park brake didn't work that good on it. It was nearly a new car all the way to her parents' house down there, and she called me and she says, I drove all the way to Mom and Daddy's house with the park brake on. What do we need to do? And I said, well, does it still stop? And she says, oh, yeah. And I said, well, then we'll rebuild the rear brakes if we need to. Just drive it on back. It'll be all right. Ain't no use in giving somebody a hard time, you know. Said the person that gives people a hard time all the time. All right. Okay, let's see. The rotor of an auxiliary parking brake on a caliper system is shaped like a hat.
True.
That's true sometimes, but not every time. That Ford 500 out there doesn't have a hat. It's got that silly little ball and dimple thing that you got to screw the thing back in. You've had to do that on them Hondas any? Or do they got that kind? I don't know. The ball and dimple kind where you got to screw the caliper in.
They are like that.
Yeah. If you get used to that, it ain't a big deal. The small brake shoes of an auxiliary parking brake tend to wear out easily even with proper use.
Oh.
That's false, but I'm going to tell you something, y'all. Every time you get a brake job where you're doing all the brakes on a, turn of the century Chevrolet that's got the hat and it's got a one-piece circular parking brake shoe, then you better go in there and look at that park brake shoe because it's probably worn out. Y'all probably sell a lot of them, don't you? Well, they sell them all the time in advance. They got them on the shelf and we replace them. And we've had to replace them when we did the brakes on these college trucks. But that thing wears out a lot. I don't know why, but it's worn out. It ain't hard to change. I mean, they're easy. They're easy to change. They're easier than the ones that y'all were fighting with the other day. Who was fighting with park brakes? Oh, that was on Saunders' car. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Only hand-activated parking brakes use a ratchet mechanism.
False.
That's false. Failure of a parking brake to release is often due to a corroded cable. That's true. We worked on that Ranger in here one time where that guy had been driving it through creeks and stuff, and wow, that was a mess. And it'll cause you issues trying to get the brakes to work right and all that, especially if somebody has mashed the park brake and the cables go out and they won't go back through. So we had to buy park brake cables for that thing and put them on there. And everything was rusted out on that truck. We had to replace the brake lines, and I mean, it was terrible. Big job. All of the following are components of a parking brake system except what?
Hydraulic tubing.
Yeah, hydraulic tubing does not work with a parking brake system unless it's one of those micro brake lock systems where you put it in between the brake pedal and the brakes and you flip a lever and you pump the brakes and it holds the hydraulic pressure. That's on the big truck stuff and industrial applications. I've put those on before. Which system of parking brakes uses the same brake shoes or pads as the service brakes? Which parking brake system, I should say, uses the same brake shoes or pads as the service brakes?
Integral.
Integral parking brakes. How many of you have ever seen a big brake drum on the drive shaft right behind the transmission? And that's the parking brake. Usually on 10.5 trucks, they'll have a great big brake drum with brake shoes in it, and you pull a lever and it applies those brake shoes and it stops the drive shaft from turning, and that's how the park brake's set up on those big trucks. That's okay as long as the drive shaft's in it. If a brake warning light stays on when the parking brake hand lever or pedal is not applied, you should do what? Both A and B. Verify the lever or pedal is returning fully to the release position. Check the switch at the parking brake hand lever or pedal. Now, how many of you know that on a lot of cars, when you turn this thing to start, it does a prove out on some of the warning lights. If that ignition switch, and on some of the Fords that were in the 90s, 90s vintage Fords, when you turn that thing to start, it may stick not far enough to keep the starter engaged, but far enough to be past the on position, and some of those warning lights will stay on, the blower won't work and all this until you click it back to the on position. So if you see a brake light that's staying on, make sure that ignition switch is returning, okay? Be careful though when you buy replacement ignition switches from the parts store, because we had one that burned up that little ground wire that feeds all of those warning light prove outs. We turned it on and the smoke came out of that thing. I ain't saying all of them are like that, but the one we bought was. Let's see. The three basic types of mechanisms used to mechanically actuate rear disc integral parking brakes include all the following except which one?
Recirculated ball?
Yeah, recirculating ball is where? Where do we find recirculating balls?
I don't know, it just sounded weird.
That's in those steering boxes like we got out there on the bench. You've got recirculating balls in them. Which actuating mechanism is common on General Motors vehicles?
The screw nut cone.
He knew about that, the screw nut cone. Imagine him getting that one right. Which actuating mechanism is common on Fords? The ball ramp, but most of the Fords now have hats, okay? There is a ball ramp 2005 Ford 500 out there that's got ball ramps on it. Parking brake controls typically include all of the following components except what? They don't have a normalizer. Okay, moving rapidly. To replace the primary front cable of a parking brake system, you should do all of the following except what? Don't remove the cable from the backing plate. I'm always telling you guys not to do that because it's too much trouble to put it back on there. Which of the following steps is done first when replacing rear cables? Why don't we disconnect the cable from the equalizer? You know what the equalizer is?
That's that bar
That little bar, yeah.
that sticks in there.
And it'll
it's
have a stud going through it where you can adjust. I mean, it's a bar that is actually, yeah, it's kind of like the cable goes and there's a bar and then there's a stud going back. In other words, each cable comes to the equalizer connects to the cable that goes up to the park brake pedal. And there's a cell phone call that I don't know who this is. Hello. Hey. Come on over here. That'll do. All right. All right. Got an air conditioning job for Moody. All right. That's good, isn't it? Okay. Which of the following steps is done? What did I say? That was A, right? Number 17. Which of the following steps is done last when replacing the rear cables? Remove the cable from the backing plate. You only do that if you absolutely have to, though. Which of the following, because in this situation you would, but if you don't have to remove that cable from the backing plate. By the way, you know how you get that out of there, right? You know that little cable's got those little fingers that pop out when you know how you get that out of there? You got a hose clamp put on it and it squeezes them fingers in. You just pull it out. Got it? You know those little fingers that pop out when you stick it through the backing plate? Put a hose clamp on, a little bitty hose clamp, tighten it up, and then pull them out of there. That's how you do it. Easiest way. And everybody's got a hose clamp around. Which of the following does not usually cause parking brakes to fail to hold? Corrosion has built up on the cable housing. That don't keep them from holding. That makes them stay hold. Parking brake linkage consists of all of the above. And finally, parking brake hand lever assemblies are simple what? Ratchets with a pawl. All right, is everybody a little smarter now than you were when you came into this room?
Huh?
You're a little smarter. Listen to that huh. Did you say duh or huh?
I said, yeah.
He said no.